The Discernment Field, Episode 1, The Crisis of Interpretation. Hello, and welcome to the Discernment Field, a podcast on mind, behavior, perception, and the search for clarity in an emotionally reactive world. This is Episode 1, The Crisis of Interpretation, Why We Can Struggle to See Clearly. We begin here because every other question in this series depends on this one. Before we can talk about emotional intelligence, critical thinking, dark psychology, manipulation, game theory, control theory, social dynamics, morality, influence, or discernment, we have to ask something more fundamental. What are we actually responding to when we respond to life? Are we responding to reality itself, or are we responding to the interpretation our body and mind have already constructed around reality? That distinction matters, because most of our conflicts do not begin with facts. It begins with meaning. It begins with the interpretation of a look, a silence, a headline, a gesture, a delay, a tone of voice, a word choice, a pattern, a memory, a threat, or an emotional charge. Something happens, and almost instantly, the mind begins organizing it into a story. This person disrespected me. That group is dangerous. This information proves what I already suspected. That silence means rejection. That disagreement means hostility. That confidence means arrogance. That uncertainty means weakness. That emotion means truth. Yet, in many cases, what we are reacting to is not the event itself. We are reacting to the meaning we have placed upon it. This is the crisis of interpretation. We live in a world where information has become faster than reflection. A world where emotion travels faster than evidence. A world where images, headlines, fragments, rumors, facial expressions, social signals, and half-formed narratives enter the nervous system before the conscious mind has had time to examine them. We are constantly receiving signals, but not always discerning them. We are constantly processing information, but not always understanding from what state we are processing it. That is the deeper problem. The modern world often tells us the crisis is misinformation, and of course misinformation exists. Deception exists, propaganda exists, emotional manipulation exists, dark psychology exists, strategic framing exists. Institutions, advertisers, ideologues, influencers, media systems, algorithms, and individuals can all shape perception. But even before manipulation reaches us, there is already an internal field through which it must pass. That field is our emotional state, our nervous system, our memory, our identity, our unmet needs, our fears, our desires, our loyalties, our wounds, our assumptions, and our need to make sense of uncertainty. So the question is not only, who is trying to influence me? The deeper question is, what inside me is available to be influenced? That is where discernment begins. Discernment is not suspicion. It is not the habit of assuming the worst. It is not a performance of intelligence. It is not the cold rejection of feeling. It is not a paranoid posture towards the world. Discernment is the disciplined art of seeing with more of yourself awake. It is the ability to notice the difference between evidence and emotional momentum, between intuition and projection, between a pattern and a prejudice, between a warning signal and a wound response, between a real threat and an old survival map being reactivated. This series is built around that territory. The discernment field is not about becoming detached from humanity. It is about becoming less possessed by immediate interpretation. It is about learning how emotion shapes perception, how language shapes reality, how power moves through social dynamics, how behavior reveals hidden incentives, how the body interprets before thought, and how clarity can be rebuilt in a world designed to keep attention reactive. The problem is not that we feel too much. The problem is that we often do not know how to interpret what we feel. We mistake intensity for truth. We mistake urgency for importance. We mistake familiarity for evidence. We mistake repetition for reality. We mistake confidence for wisdom. We mistake fear for foresight. We mistake outrage for morality. We mistake emotional relief for resolution. Once interpretation becomes fused with identity, it becomes very difficult to question. If I believe my interpretation protects me, then anyone who challenges it may feel like a threat. If I believe my interpretation makes me good, then nuance may feel like betrayal. If I believe my interpretation gives me belonging, then doubt may feel like exile. If I believe my interpretation gives me control, then uncertainty may feel unbearable. This is why clarity requires courage, not the theatrical kind of courage that declares certainty loudly, but the quieter courage required to pause when the body wants to react. The courage to ask, what am I adding to this? The courage to admit, I may be interpreting through fear. The courage to say, I do not yet know enough. The courage to remain open without becoming gullible, skeptical, without becoming cynical, emotionally intelligent, without becoming emotionally ruled. That is the field we are entering. Throughout this series, we will move between the inner and outer layers of discernment. We will look at real-life scenarios, social manipulation, emotional intelligence, cognitive distortion, game theory, control theory, relational dynamics, dark psychology, contemplative reasoning, deduction, reduction, and the patterns that shape human behavior beneath the surface. But in this first episode, we begin with the foundation. Why do we struggle to see clearly? Not because we are unintelligent, not because we lack access to information, not because we are simply irrational, but because perception is not passive. Interpretation is not neutral. The mind does not merely record reality. It organizes reality around survival, identity, emotion, memory, and meaning. So before we can learn how to think more clearly, we have to learn how interpretation is formed. Before we can detect manipulation outside us, we have to understand distortion inside us. Before we can become discerning, we have to understand why reaction so often arrives first. Part 1. The world beneath reaction. Reaction is fast. Discernment is slow. Reaction wants immediate certainty. Discernment can remain with complexity. Reaction looks for relief. Discernment looks for reality. Reaction says, I know what this means. Discernment asks, what else could this mean? That simple difference sits at the heart of this episode. Most people do not experience themselves as reactive. They experience themselves as reasonable. Even when someone is angry, defensive, frightened, ashamed, or morally charged, they usually believe their reaction is justified by what is happening, and sometimes it is. Sometimes anger is appropriate. Sometimes fear is intelligent. Sometimes suspicion is protective. Sometimes disgust is morally meaningful. Sometimes the body registers something before the conscious mind can explain it. Discernment does not mean dismissing those signals. It means learning how to read them without being ruled by them. A bodily signal is not the same as a conclusion. The body may say, something feels wrong, that matters, but the next step is not always, therefore my interpretation is correct. The next step is, what is the signal? What is the context? What evidence exists? What history may be involved? What pattern is being activated? What am I protecting? What am I afraid of seeing? What am I afraid of not seeing? This is where many people lose clarity. They move too quickly from sensation to conclusion. A message feels cold, someone does not care. A disagreement feels threatening, someone is against me. A confident speaker feels trustworthy, they must know what they are talking about. A repeated claim feels familiar, it must be true. A person's silence feels suspicious, they must be hiding something. A group feels different, therefore they must be dangerous. A narrative feels emotionally satisfying, it must be accurate. This is not stupidity. This is how we as humans experience pattern making. The brain and body are constantly trying to reduce uncertainty. They look for patterns, meanings, predictions, and shortcuts. In ordinary life, this is necessary. Without shortcuts, we would be overwhelmed by complexity. But the same system that helps us move through the world can also distort the world when emotion becomes too intense, when identity becomes too invested, or when social pressure becomes too strong. The modern environment intensifies this problem. We are not living in a slow interpretive culture. We are living in a reaction economy. Everything competes for attention. Headlines are written to provoke. Algorithms amplify emotional engagement. Public conversation rewards speed, certainty, and performance. Social media compresses complex realities into fragments. Nuance is often punished because it slows the emotional momentum of the crowd. People are encouraged to take positions before they have processed the situation, to react before they have reflected, to identify with a side before they have examined the frame, and because reaction creates energy, it feels alive. Outrage feels powerful, fear feels urgent, certainty feels stabilizing, belonging feels safe, moral clarity feels clean, blame feels relieving, suspicion feels protective. The problem is that none of these feelings automatically proves accuracy. A person can feel completely certain and still be wrong. A crowd can feel morally united and still be distorted. A nervous system can feel danger and still be responding to memory rather than present reality. An argument can feel logical while being built around an emotional need. This is why the first discipline of the discernment field is not argument. It is an observation. Observation before conclusion. Not passive observation. Not a weak observation. Not an indecisive observation. But conscious observation. The kind that notices the stimulus, the emotional response, the assumptions forming, the social pressures involved, the incentives beneath the surface, and the possible interpretations that have not yet been considered. Let's make that practical. Imagine someone you care about replies to a long message with only a few words. There is the stimulus, a short reply. Then there is the emotional activation, maybe disappointment, anxiety, embarrassment, irritation, or rejection. Then the interpretation forms. They are pulling away. They do not value me. I said too much. They are annoyed. I have lost connection. Then the behavior follows. You withdraw, over-explain, accuse, chase reassurance, or become cold in return. But what actually happened? A short reply. Everything else may be possible, but it is not yet certain. They may be tired. They may be busy. They may not know how to respond. They may have been distracted. They may be emotionally unavailable. They may be avoiding something. They may be signaling distance. They may be completely unaware of how it landed. Discernment does not mean pretending there is no meaning. It means refusing to collapse all possibilities into the one that most strongly matches your wound. That is a crucial line. Reaction often chooses the interpretation that fits the wound. Discernment looks for the interpretation that best fits the whole field. The same applies beyond relationships. A public figure says something ambiguous. A news story breaks before all details are known. A workplace decision is made without explanation. A friend changes their tone. A stranger looks at you a certain way. A social group begins repeating a phrase. A moral issue becomes emotionally charged. In each case, the first interpretation may arrive with force. But force is not the same as clarity. This is where emotional intelligence and critical thinking must come together. Critical thinking without emotional awareness can become sterile, defensive, or arrogant. Emotional intelligence without critical thinking can become overly impressionable, trapped in feeling, or unable to test perception. Discernment requires both. It asks us to feel the signal, but also examine the story. It asks us to respect the body, but not make the body the only authority. It asks us to think, but not pretend that thinking is separate from state. This is especially important because people often believe they are thinking clearly when they are actually thinking from activation. When the nervous system is activated, perception narrows. The mind searches for threat, confirmation, and resolution. It becomes less interested in complexity and more interested in safety. This does not mean the person becomes incapable of thought. It means thought becomes recruited by the survival state. Intelligence may still function, but it may function in service of defense, justification, control, or emotional relief. That is why intelligent people can misread situations so dramatically. Their intellect does not disappear. It becomes employed by the interpretation of their state that has already been chosen. This is one of the most important insights in the whole series. Intelligence is not the same as discernment. A person can analyze endlessly and still never question the emotional premise beneath their analysis. They can gather evidence, build arguments, quote studies, detect patterns, identify contradictions, and still be protecting a conclusion that was formed before the thinking began. This is not rare. It is common. It happens in relationships, politics, religion, activism, academia, media, families, institutions, and personal identity. So when we talk about the world beneath reaction, we are talking about the hidden sequence that often happens before conscious reasoning takes ownership of the response. First, something is perceived. Then the body assigns significance. Then emotion gives it urgency. Then memory provides associations. Then identity asks what this means about me, us, or them. Then the mind begins forming a story. Then the behavior follows. Only afterwards do we often call the whole thing my opinion. But discernment interrupts this sequence. It does not destroy emotion. It creates space around interpretation. It says, pause. What is the stimulus? What is the story? What is the state? What is the evidence? What is the incentive? What is the pattern? What is the possibility that I am resisting? Because it would require me to feel something uncomfortable. That final question matters because discernment is not only about detecting deception in the world. It is also about detecting self-protection in the self. Sometimes we misinterpret because we are afraid. Sometimes because we want to be right. Sometimes because belonging feels safer than truth. Sometimes because anger is easier than grief. Sometimes suspicion feels stronger than vulnerability. Sometimes because certainty protects us from the humility of not knowing. This is why the discernment field has to begin with us, not the information stream. Because information does not enter a neutral system. It enters a living body. It enters history. It enters the nervous system. It enters a set of loyalties, fears, hopes, wounds, and desires. It enters a person who is trying to survive psychologically, socially, emotionally, and sometimes physically. So the work of discernment is not simply asking, is this true? It is asking, what is happening in me as I decide whether this is true? That is the turn. That is where the series opens. Until we understand the world beneath reaction, we remain vulnerable to every force that can provoke reaction and call it truth. Part 2. The emotional lens, emotion as an interpretive filter. If part 1 was about the world beneath reaction, then part 2 takes us deeper into the lens through which reaction often forms, emotion. Because emotion does not only tell us how we feel. Emotion changes what we notice, what we remember, what we expect, what we fear, what we desire, and what we believe something means. This is one of the most important foundations of discernment. We do not interpret the world from a purely rational position. We interpret the world through state. We interpret through fear, anger, shame, desire, grief, hope, loneliness, loyalty, resentment, envy, pride, longing, and the emotional histories we often do not realize are present. Most of us like to believe that emotion arrives after interpretation. Something happens, we understand it, and then we feel something about it. But often, the sequence is much more subtle. Something happens, the body feels something, and the mind begins interpreting reality through the feeling that has already arrived. A person looks away while we are speaking, and if we are already insecure, we may read disinterest. If we are angry, we may read disrespect. If we are afraid of abandonment, we may read rejection. If we are suspicious, we may read deception. If we are calm, we may simply notice that they looked away. The same stimulus becomes a different reality depending on the emotional lens. That does not mean emotion is false. Emotion is not the enemy of discernment. In fact, emotion can be one of its most important signals. Fear can alert us to danger. Anger can show us where a boundary may have been crossed. Sadness can reveal attachment. Shame can reveal exposure, vulnerability, or fear of social rejection. Disgust can reveal a moral boundary. Desire can reveal longing, attraction, ambition, or unmet need. But emotion becomes dangerous when it is treated as complete evidence. A feeling may be meaningful without being fully accurate. That distinction is crucial. I feel unsafe is a valid internal experience. This person is definitely dangerous is an interpretation. I feel rejected is a valid emotional signal. They are deliberately abandoning me is an interpretation. I feel angry may reveal that something matters. I am morally right because I am angry is a leap. I feel drawn to this person may reveal attraction, familiarity, chemistry, or desire. This person is good for me because I feel drawn to them may be a distortion. Discernment begins when we stop dismissing emotion, but also stop worshipping it. Emotion is information, not a final judgment. It is a signal, not the whole map. This matters because emotional states organize perception. Fear looks for a threat. Anger looks for offense. Shame looks for exposure. Desire looks for fulfillment. Grief looks for loss. Envy looks for comparison. Guilt looks for responsibility. Pride looks for validation. Loneliness looks for connection. Each emotion narrows attention around what feels most relevant to that state. When fear is active, neutral information can appear threatening. When shame is active, feedback can feel like humiliation. When anger is active, ambiguity can look like deliberate disrespect. When desire is active, warning signs can be minimized because the mind wants the emotional reward. This is not a weakness, it is human. The mind and body are not separate machines. What we feel shapes what we can see. And because emotion creates urgency, it often gives interpretation a false authority. The more intense the feeling, the more certain the interpretation can seem. That is why the phrase "I know what I feel" can easily become confused with "I know what is true." But these are not the same. You can know what you feel and still not know exactly what happened. You can feel deeply hurt and still misread intent. You can feel suspicious and still be wrong about motive. You can feel morally charged and still be caught inside a partial frame. You can feel calm and still be avoiding something. Emotional truth is not the same as factual truth, and discernment requires the humility to hold both. This is where emotional intelligence becomes essential, but perhaps not in the simplified way it is often presented. Emotional intelligence is not just about being able to name emotions. It is not just being kind, empathetic, or socially smooth. It is not merely staying calm, avoiding conflict, or appearing mature. Emotional intelligence, at its deeper level, is the capacity to notice how emotion is shaping perception before that perception hardens into belief, behavior, or identity. It is the ability to say, "I am angry, therefore my attention may now be searching for evidence of disrespect." It is the ability to say, "I feel ashamed, therefore I may be hearing criticism where there is only correction." It is the ability to say, "I feel afraid, therefore my body may be looking for danger before my mind has assessed the whole situation." It is the ability to say, "I desire this outcome, therefore I may be ignoring information that threatens the fantasy." That is not emotional suppression. That is emotional literacy. It is the capacity to read the inner weather without mistaking the weather for the whole world. A helpful way to understand this is through everyday conflict. Imagine two people in a relationship. One person says, "You never listen to me." The other immediately becomes defensive and says, "That's not fair. I always listen." Now, on the surface, the conflict appears to be about listening, but beneath the words, there may be several emotional lenses operating at once. The first person may be speaking through loneliness, accumulated resentment, or the fear of not mattering. The second person may be hearing the statement through shame, failure, or the fear of being seen as inadequate. Neither person is responding only to the sentence. They are responding to the emotional meaning the sentence has activated inside them. This is why people often argue past each other. One person is trying to express hurt while the other is defending against blame. One person is trying to be seen while the other is trying not to feel accused. One person wants repair while the other hears an attack. Without discernment, both people believe they are responding to what is happening, when in reality they are responding to different emotional interpretations of what is happening. This same pattern appears in public life. A headline appears online. Before the full context is known, people begin reacting. Some feel outrage. Some feel vindication. Some feel fear. Some feel moral superiority. Some feel disgust. Some feel tribal loyalty. The emotional lens determines what is noticed, what is ignored, what is amplified, and what becomes impossible to consider. If the headline confirms what someone already fears, it spreads quickly. If it threatens their identity, it is dismissed. If it gives them a clear villain, it becomes emotionally satisfying. If it complicates their position, it may be avoided. This is where emotion and social reinforcement become powerful. Once an emotional interpretation is shared by a group, it becomes harder to question. Not because the group is necessarily wrong, but because belonging begins to merge with perception. To question, the interpretation may feel like betraying the group. To ask for nuance may feel like defending the enemy. To slow down may feel like weakness. This is how emotional fields form. A group not only shares information, it shares a nervous system atmosphere. It shares urgency, threat, certainty, disgust, hope, grievance, or moral charge. And once that field becomes strong enough, the individual may no longer be interpreting alone. They are interpreting through the emotional momentum of the collective. That is one reason discernment requires solitude, or at least moments of internal separation. Not isolation, not detachment from people, but enough inner space to ask, would I still see this the same way if no one around me was rewarding this interpretation? That is a powerful question. Would I still believe this if it did not give me belonging? Would I still repeat this if it did not give me status? Would I still feel so certain if the crowd was not certain with me? Would I still call this truth if it did not provide emotional relief? This is difficult because human beings are social creatures. We are shaped by each other. We regulate and dysregulate each other. We borrow each other's certainty. We absorb each other's fear. We mirror each other's outrage. We often mistake collective intensity for collective wisdom. But crowds can be emotionally intelligent, and crowds can also become emotionally possessed. A shared feeling does not automatically make an interpretation accurate. It only makes it powerful. This is where dark psychology often enters the picture, not as something mystical or theatrical, but as the strategic use of emotional lenses. Manipulation does not usually begin by defeating someone's reasoning. It begins by activating the emotional state that makes certain interpretations more likely. If someone can make you afraid, they can influence what you perceive as threatening. If they can make you ashamed, they can influence what you will hide or apologize for. If they can make you angry, they can influence where you direct your energy. If they can make you feel special, they can influence what you overlook. If they can make you feel guilty, they can influence what you tolerate. If they can make you feel desperate for belonging, they can influence what you accept. This is why the emotionally unexamined person is easier to steer. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they do not yet know which emotional doors can be opened from the outside. A manipulative person, group, institution, or system does not need to control everything you think. It only needs to control the emotional frame through which you begin thinking. Once the emotional lens is established, the mind often completes the rest of the work on its own. This can happen in relationships. Someone withdraws affection, creating anxiety, then reappears with warmth, creating relief. The emotional contrast becomes addictive. The person begins interpreting inconsistency as depth, intensity as connection, and relief as love. This can happen in workplaces. A manager creates uncertainty, then positions themselves as the only source of approval or security. The employee begins interpreting compliance as safety. This can happen in the media. A system repeatedly exposes people to a threat, then offers them a narrative that explains the threat, names the enemy, and provides emotional resolution. The audience begins interpreting the narrative as clear because it reduces inner chaos. Again, this is not about becoming paranoid. It is about becoming observant. Emotional influence is part of human life. We influence each other constantly. The ethical question is whether that influence expands awareness or narrows it. Does it help someone see more clearly, or does it trap them inside a reactive state? Does it invite reflection, or does it demand immediate allegiance? Does it tolerate complexity, or does it punish hesitation? Does it regulate the nervous system, or does it keep it activated for advantage? In the discernment field, this distinction will matter throughout the whole series, because discernment is not simply the ability to detect lies. It is the ability to notice when a field is being created around interpretation. A fear field, a shame field, a desire field, a loyalty field, a moral field, a scarcity field, a rescue field, a conflict field. Once the field is active, people inside it may believe they are freely choosing their interpretations, when in reality the range of acceptable interpretations has already narrowed. This is also why self-awareness must go beyond personality. Many people know their preferences, their opinions, their labels, their values, or their wounds, but they do not know how their state changes their perception in real time. They may know they have abandonment wounds, but not notice when those wounds are actively interpreting someone's silence. They may know they value truth, but not notice when pride stops them from revising a false belief. They may know they dislike manipulation, but not notice when fear makes them vulnerable to a manipulative frame. They may know they are empathetic, but not notice when guilt makes them easy to pressure. The emotional lens is often clearest in hindsight. After the argument, we realize we overreacted. After the panic, we realize we exaggerated the danger. After the attraction fades, we realize we ignored obvious signs. After the group mood passes, we realize we repeated something without examining it. After the shame settles, we realize the criticism was not as devastating as it felt. But discernment asks us to shorten the distance between activation and awareness. The aim is not perfection. It is recovery speed. It is the ability to notice sooner, pause sooner, question sooner, and return sooner. So a practical question emerges. How do we begin reading the emotional lens before it takes over interpretation? The first step is naming the state, not analyzing the whole situation, not building a case, just naming the state. I am afraid. I am angry. I feel ashamed. I feel exposed. I feel drawn in. I feel threatened. I feel desperate for clarity. I feel the need to prove something. This matters because naming creates distance. It does not erase the emotion, but it prevents the emotion from becoming invisible. Once the state is named, the interpretation can be examined. The second step is separating feeling from conclusion. I feel rejected does not automatically mean I have been rejected. I feel unsafe does not automatically mean this person is unsafe. I feel certain does not automatically mean I'm correct. I feel disgusted does not automatically mean this thing is evil. I feel confused does not automatically mean someone is deceiving me. Sometimes those conclusions may be true, but discernment does not skip the examination because the feeling is strong. The third step is asking what the emotion wants. Fear often wants protection. Anger often wants justice or control. Shame often wants hiding. Desire often wants possession or union. Grief often wants meaning. Envy often wants recognition. Guilt often wants repair. Loneliness often wants attachment. When you know what the emotion wants, you can better understand how it may be shaping your interpretation. If anger wants someone to blame, it may simplify the field. If fear wants certainty, it may accept a premature explanation. If desire wants connection, it may romanticize ambiguity. If shame wants escape, it may distort the intentions of others. The fourth step is widening the frame. Ask, what else could this mean? What evidence supports my interpretation? What evidence complicates it? What would I think if I were comma? What would I advise someone else to consider? What interpretation am I emotionally attached to? What possibility am I resisting? What outcome am I trying to avoid feeling? These questions do not weaken discernment, they strengthen it. A perception that cannot survive questioning is not clarity, it is fragility. And finally, the fifth step is integrating the emotion rather than suppressing it. Discernment is not an instruction to become blank. It is not about rising above feeling in a way that makes us less human. It is about letting feeling become part of a wider intelligence. Emotion brings intensity, reason brings structure, the body brings a signal, reflection brings context. Discernment emerges when these layers are allowed to speak without any one of them becoming a dictator. This is the emotional lens. It is the lens through which human beings fall in love, go to war, form identities, defend beliefs, misread friends, follow leaders, reject evidence, sense danger, create meaning, and sometimes finally wake up to themselves. We cannot remove this lens completely, and perhaps we should not want to. Emotion gives life meaning. It tells us what matters. But if emotion is not examined, it can also turn meaning into distortion. So the work is not to stop feeling. The work is to feel with awareness, to notice when emotion sharpens perception and when it narrows it, to honor the signal without surrendering the whole interpretation to it, to recognize that the body may be telling us something important, but that importance still needs to be translated with care, because once emotion becomes the lens, reality does not disappear, but it bends, and the discerning mind learns to ask, how much of what I am seeing is the world, and how much of it is the state through which I am seeing? Part 3. The nervous system and perception. Why the body interprets before the mind. If emotion is the lens through which interpretation bends, then the nervous system is the deeper field from which that lens often forms. Before the mind has arranged a thought, before the argument has become clear, before the story has found language, the body is already asking a question. Am I safe? Am I threatened? Am I connected? Am I exposed? Am I in control? Am I about to lose something? Am I about to be rejected? Am I about to be harmed? This is one of the most important ideas in the discernment field. Perception does not begin as an intellectual event. Perception begins as a living process. The body is not simply carrying the mind around. It is participating in interpretation. It is scanning, registering, filtering, preparing, contracting, mobilizing, relaxing, orienting, and sometimes reacting before conscious thought has fully arrived. We often imagine that we see the world, then think about it, then feel something, then act. But in real life, the sequence is often much faster and more embodied. The body senses tone, timing, facial expression, rhythm, silence, posture, distance, atmosphere, social threat, uncertainty, and emotional charge. It begins forming an orientation before the conscious mind can explain why. This does not mean the body is always right. It means the body is always involved. That distinction matters. Because many people either dismiss the body completely or treat it as the absolute truth. One person says, it's all in your head, as though bodily signals are meaningless. Another says, my body knows, as though every internal sensation is pure wisdom. Discernment sits between these extremes. The body does know things, but it also remembers things. The body detects patterns, but it can also project old patterns onto new situations. The body protects us, but sometimes it protects us from ghosts of the past rather than actual dangers in the present. So we have to learn how to listen without surrendering judgment. One useful way to understand this is through the idea of neuroception, a term associated with Stephen Porges and polyvagal theory. In simple terms, neuroception refers to the nervous system's subconscious detection of safety or threat. It is not the same as conscious perception. You do not sit there and rationally decide whether every room, person, tone, expression, or silence is safe. The body is already scanning beneath awareness. It reads cues. It tracks patterns. It notices whether a connection feels possible or danger feels near. Now, we do not need to turn this into dogma. We do not need to use any theory as a rigid ideology. But the basic insight is useful. Human beings are not neutral processors of information. We are state-dependent interpreters. The state of the nervous system affects what becomes visible, what becomes threatening, what becomes attractive, what becomes believable, and what becomes impossible to consider. When the nervous system is relatively regulated, perception has more space. There is more capacity to hold complexity, more ability to listen, more ability to pause, more ability to recognize ambiguity without immediately forcing it into a fixed conclusion. In a regulated state, disagreement does not automatically become an attack. Silence does not automatically become abandonment. Uncertainty does not automatically become danger. Criticism does not automatically become humiliation. A mistake does not automatically become identity collapse. But when the nervous system is activated, the field narrows, the body prepares, attention contracts, the mind searches for danger, explanation, blame, control, or escape. The world becomes more immediate, more urgent, more charged. The question is no longer, what is the fullest truth here? The question becomes, how do I get safe? This is where discernment begins to collapse. Not because the person lacks intelligence, but because the whole system has shifted into protection. In sympathetic activation, the body mobilizes. It prepares for fight or flight. The heart rate may increase. The breath may shorten. The muscles may tense. Attention may become sharper, but also narrower. The person may feel energized, defensive, agitated, restless, urgent, argumentative, or compelled to act. In this state, interpretation often becomes threat-oriented. The mind looks for the opponent, the danger, the insult, the inconsistency, the escape route. It may become very fast, but not necessarily very wise. In collapse or shutdown states, the opposite may happen. Energy drops, clarity fades, the person may feel numb, helpless, detached, foggy, passive, defeated, or unable to respond. In this state, interpretation may become fatalistic. There is no point. Nothing will change. I cannot deal with this. I do not matter. It is easier to disappear. Again, this may feel like the truth, but it may be state speaking. It may be the body conserving energy, protecting itself from overwhelm, or retreating from an emotional load it cannot metabolize in that moment. Then there is fawning, where the nervous system seeks safety through appeasement. The person may become agreeable, pleasing, apologetic, over-explaining, emotionally hyper-attuned, or overly responsible for other people's states. In this mode, discernment can become distorted by the need to avoid conflict or rejection. The person may call something compassion when it is actually fear. They may call something forgiveness when it is actually self-abandonment. They may call something understanding when it is actually compliance. This is why nervous system awareness matters so much to discernment, because each state tells a different story. Fight says, I must confront. Flight says, I must escape. Freeze says, I cannot move. Fawn says, I must please. Regulation says, I can observe. That last one is essential. Observation is much easier when the body does not feel immediately threatened. This is not about becoming soft or passive. It is about having enough internal space to see more than one possible meaning. The more threatened the body feels, the more likely the mind is to collapse complexity into survival categories: safe or unsafe, ally or enemy, right or wrong, control or danger, belonging or exile, dominance or submission. Once reality is reduced to survival categories, discernment becomes extremely difficult. This is why emotionally charged information spreads so easily. A calm piece of information asks the mind to consider. A fear-based piece of information asks the body to react, and reaction is faster. If a headline, image, accusation, or rumor activates threat, the nervous system may treat it as urgent before it has been properly evaluated. The person may share it, defend it, argue about it, or emotionally invest in it before they have examined its source, context, incentive, or accuracy. This is also why manipulation often targets the body before the intellect. If you can activate fear, shame, anger, desire, disgust, guilt, or urgency, you can narrow the field of interpretation. You do not have to control every thought. You only have to create the state in which certain thoughts become more likely. This is how advertising works. This is how propaganda works. This is how toxic relationships work. This is how some forms of leadership work. This is how social media often works. The nervous system is moved first. The mind rationalizes afterwards. But again, we have to be careful. The answer is not to distrust every strong feeling. Sometimes fear is intelligent. Sometimes anger is accurate. Sometimes disgust is morally significant. Sometimes the body does notice something before the mind can articulate it. Many people have had the experience of feeling something was off before they could explain why. Later, details emerge that confirmed the signal. The body can detect subtle inconsistencies, a mismatch between words and tone, warmth and control, charm and tension, reassurance and pressure, kindness and hidden aggression. The problem is not bodily knowing. The problem is unexamined bodily certainty. Discernment asks, is this a present signal, a past imprint, or a mixture of both? That question alone can transform interpretation, because often it is a mixture. Someone may genuinely be behaving ambiguously, and that ambiguity may also be activating an old wound. Someone may be manipulative, and your history may also be intensifying the reaction. A situation may contain real risk, and your nervous system may still be exaggerating the scale of danger. A person may be trustworthy, and your body may still struggle to receive safety, because safety itself feels unfamiliar. Human perception is rarely clean. It is layered. This is why the body must be included in critical thinking. Traditional ideas of critical thinking often focus on logic, evidence, argument structure, fallacies, source evaluation, and reasoning. All of that matters. But in real life, a person can understand logic and still be unable to access it when activated. They can know what a fallacy is and still fall into one when ashamed. They can know how to evaluate evidence and still ignore it when identity is threatened. They can understand manipulation and still be manipulated through loneliness, fear, guilt, or desire. So critical thinking without nervous system awareness is incomplete. It teaches people how to think, but not how the state affects thinking. This is where the discernment field becomes more than a thinking framework. It becomes an embodied framework. We are not only asking, is this argument valid? We are asking, what is my body doing while I evaluate this argument? Are my muscles tense? Is my breath shallow? Do I feel pressured to decide quickly? Do I feel afraid of being wrong? Do I feel excited because this confirms what I already believe? Do I feel disgusted before I have understood? Do I feel relief because someone has given me a villain? Do I feel special because I think I see what others cannot? These questions matter because the state of the body becomes part of the interpretive environment. There is also a relational dimension here. Nervous systems influence each other. We are not isolated thinkers sealed inside private minds. Tone, rhythm, facial expression, posture, pacing, silence, and emotional intensity all affect the field between people. A calm person can help regulate a conversation. An aggressive person can activate defense. A vague person can create anxiety. A contemptuous person can trigger shame or anger. A warm person can create trust. A seductive person can lower skepticism. A chaotic person can pull others into instability. This is why language is not only symbolic, it is regulatory. A sentence does not only carry meaning through the dictionary definition of its words, it carries the state through tone, timing, implication, rhythm, and emotional charge. The same words can soothe or threaten depending on how they are delivered. We need to talk can feel caring, ominous, controlling, or honest depending on the field around it. I'm fine can mean peace, withdrawal, resentment, fear, avoidance, or genuine calm. The nervous system often hears the field before the mind interprets the sentence. That is why discernment in relationships is so complex. We are never only interpreting words, we are interpreting tone, history, timing, consistency, behavior, atmosphere, and our own bodily response. Someone may say the right words while the body detects pressure. Someone may speak clumsily but sincerely. Someone may appear calm while actually controlling the frame. Someone may appear emotional while telling the truth. Without discernment, we may overvalue presentation and undervalue pattern, or we may overvalue our reaction and undervalue context. A practical example, imagine someone apologizes. The words are correct. They say, "I'm sorry, I understand what I did." On the surface, the sentence sounds accountable, but the nervous system may still register something uneasy. Why? Perhaps the tone feels flat. Perhaps the timing feels strategic. Perhaps they apologize only when consequences appear. Perhaps their body language communicates irritation rather than remorse. Perhaps your history with them tells you the words rarely lead to behavioral change. In that case, the body's unease may be useful information. But there is another possibility. Perhaps the apology is sincere, and your body struggles to receive it because you have learned not to trust repair. Perhaps closeness after conflict feels unsafe. Perhaps vulnerability feels threatening. Perhaps your nervous system expects betrayal, even when the present situation is different. In that case, the body's unease is still meaningful, but it may not be accurate about the other person. It may be accurate about your history. This is discernment, not ignoring the signal, not obeying it blindly, but translating it carefully. The body speaks in sensation, contraction, energy, impulse, temperature, breath, tension, numbness, movement, and emotional charge. The mind speaks in story, explanation, belief, judgment, image, language, and prediction. Discernment requires a conversation between them, not a dictatorship of reason over body, not a dictatorship of body over reason, a conversation. So the question becomes, how do we practice this? The first step is to notice the state before content. Before you decide what something means, ask, what state am I in? Am I calm, activated, numb, ashamed, angry, afraid, eager, defensive, lonely, or desperate for certainty? This does not answer the whole question, but it tells you what lens may be operating. The second step is to slow the body enough for perception to widen. This does not have to be dramatic. It may mean taking a few breaths, relaxing the jaw, stepping away from the screen, delaying the reply, walking outside, placing attention on physical sensation, or simply saying, I do not need to interpret this instantly. The aim is not to erase emotion. The aim is to create enough space that emotion does not become the only interpreter. The third step is to ask whether the reaction matches the present moment. Is the intensity proportional? Is this response about what is happening now, or does it feel older? Have I felt this exact pattern before in very different situations? Am I reacting to this person, or to everyone who has ever made me feel this way? These questions are not comfortable, but they are powerful. The fourth step is to return to observable reality. What was said? What was done? What is the pattern over time? What evidence exists? What evidence is missing? What am I assuming? What would change my mind? This brings the body's signal into relationship with reality testing. The fifth step is integration. After observing the body and examining the evidence, we ask, what is the most grounded response available? Not the most reactive response. Not the most pleasing response. Not the most intellectually impressive response. The most grounded response. Sometimes that means setting a boundary. Sometimes it means asking a question. Sometimes it means waiting. Sometimes it means apologizing. Sometimes it means leaving. Sometimes it means allowing uncertainty to remain unresolved until more information appears. This is how discernment becomes embodied, not by escaping the body, but by learning its language. Not by treating every sensation as truth, but by recognizing every sensation as data. Not by forcing calm as a performance, but by creating enough regulation for clearer perception to return, because the body interprets before the mind. And if we do not understand the body's role in interpretation, we may spend our lives defending thoughts that were actually born from states we never noticed. Part 4, the architecture of influence, how interpretation becomes shaped. If Part 3 explored how the nervous system participates in perception, then Part 4 moves outward into the world that constantly tries to shape what perception becomes. Because interpretation does not form in isolation. It forms inside environments. It forms inside relationships, media systems, institutions, families, belief systems, cultures, algorithms, status games, and repeated language patterns. What we think is our view is often the result of many forces arranging the frame before we even begin thinking. This does not mean every influence is sinister. Influence is unavoidable. Parents influence children. Teachers influence students. Friends influence each other. Art influences emotion. Language influences meaning. Culture gives us symbols through which we understand ourselves. Even a calm conversation can influence someone by helping their nervous system settle enough to see things differently. Influence only becomes dangerous when it narrows awareness while pretending to expand it, when it shapes interpretation without revealing its own frame, or when it uses emotion to push people towards conclusions they have not consciously chosen. This is where the architecture of influence matters. Influence is rarely only about what is said. It is about how a reality is arranged around what is said. The frame, the tone, the timing, the repetition, the emotional charge, the authority behind the message, the social pressure around it, the threat of exclusion, the reward for agreement, the punishment for doubt, and the implied identity of those who accept or reject it. By the time a message reaches conscious thought, much of the interpretive environment may already have been built. A simple example is framing. Framing is the way information is positioned so that certain interpretations become more likely. If someone says, "He finally admitted the truth," the listener is guided towards guilt or concealment. If they say, "He clarified a misunderstanding," the listener is guided towards innocence or complexity. The factual event may be similar, but the frame changes the emotional field around it. In relationships, framing can be even more subtle. "I'm only telling you this because I care about you" can be genuine concern, or it can be a way of making criticism harder to challenge. "Everyone else sees it too" can be a sincere observation, or it can be social pressure disguised as evidence. "You're too sensitive" can be feedback, or it can be a way to invalidate perception. The discerning question is not only what is being said, it is what frame am I being invited to enter. Once a frame is accepted, the mind often begins working inside it. If the frame is, "This person is dangerous," ambiguous behavior becomes evidence of danger. If the frame is, "This person is a victim," their harmful behavior may be excused. If the frame is, "This group is enlightened," criticism becomes ignorance. If the frame is, "This authority knows best," doubt becomes immaturity. If the frame is, "You are broken and need saving," dependence can start to feel like healing. The frame does not have to control every detail. It only has to define the interpretive boundaries. This is how language shapes reality. Not magically, not in the sense that words simply create the world out of nothing, but in the sense that words organize attention. They tell us where to look, what to fear, what to value, what to ignore, who to blame, who to trust, and what emotional posture to adopt. This is where the mirror linguistic hypothesis becomes relevant to the series. Language is not only symbolic communication, it is regulatory. It moves through tone, implication, timing, emphasis, rhythm, and relational atmosphere. It not only describes a reality, it can alter the state through which reality is interpreted. A sentence can calm the body or activate it. A repeated phrase can become a mental pathway. A label can compress a complex human being into a category. A slogan can replace inquiry with belonging. A question can open perception or trap it. A story can make one outcome feel inevitable while hiding other possibilities. This is why influence often begins at the level of language. If the words are chosen carefully enough, the listener may feel they have concluded themselves, when in reality the path has been narrowed before they started walking. Repetition is another major part of the architecture. Familiarity can feel like truth. The more often we hear something, the easier it becomes to process, and the easier something is to process, the more plausible it can feel. This does not mean repeated claims are false. It means repetition has an effect regardless of truth. A lie repeated often enough can become familiar. A half-truth repeated without context can become a worldview. A phrase repeated in a group can become a badge of belonging. A narrative repeated in media can become the emotional background of a culture. This is especially powerful when repetition is combined with emotional charge. A neutral statement may not travel far, but a repeated statement that triggers fear, outrage, disgust, hope, humiliation, or moral superiority begins to attach itself to the nervous system. It is no longer only information, it becomes a state. People do not simply remember the words. They remember how the words made them feel. And once a phrase becomes attached to a feeling, it can be reactivated quickly. A single label, image, or soundbite can bring back the whole emotional field. This is why social environments matter so much. Human beings do not only hold beliefs privately, we hold them relationally. We learn which interpretations receive approval, which ones create tension, which ones bring status, which ones risk rejection, which ones make us feel intelligent, kind, rebellious, loyal, pure, brave, or morally superior. In many groups, the permitted interpretation is silently taught. Nobody has to explicitly say, "You must think this." The group simply rewards certain conclusions and punishes hesitation. In a family, this might look like everyone agreeing not to name a problem, because naming it would disrupt the system. In a workplace, it might look like everyone is pretending that a bad leader is inspiring, because honesty carries consequences. In an ideological group, it might look like doubt being reframed as betrayal. In a friendship group, it might look like loyalty being measured by shared dislike of an outsider. In online culture, it might look like people performing certainty because uncertainty gets no applause. This is where game theory begins to enter the field, not in a dry mathematical sense, but as a way of asking, what incentives are shaping behavior? What does this person gain by presenting the situation this way? What does the group reward? What does the system punish? Who benefits if this interpretation becomes dominant? Who loses status if another interpretation is considered? What behavior is being reinforced? Many interpretations survive not because they are true, but because they are useful to someone. A family narrative may protect the parent. A workplace narrative may protect the institution. A political narrative may protect the movement. A relationship narrative may protect the manipulator. A personal narrative may protect the ego. A cultural narrative may protect the status quo. This does not mean every narrative is consciously invented. Often, people believe the narratives that benefit them. That is part of what makes them powerful. Self-interest does not always feel like self-interest from the inside. It often feels like the truth. Control theory also becomes useful here because influence often works through feedback loops. A behavior is rewarded, so it repeats. A doubt is punished, so it disappears. An emotional reaction gets attention, so it intensifies. A person complies, and conflict reduces, so compliance becomes reinforced. A group repeats a phrase and receives belonging, so the phrase spreads. An algorithm amplifies outrage because outrage creates engagement, so the culture becomes more outraged. The system does not need a single mastermind. The feedback loop itself can begin shaping behavior. This is important because people often look for influence only in obvious places: the manipulative individual, the propaganda campaign, the controlling leader, the deceptive message. But influence is also structural. It lives in incentives, environments, rhythms, platforms, rewards, punishments, and repeated emotional conditioning. A person may feel they are freely choosing their interpretation while moving inside a system that constantly rewards one kind of perception and discourages another. In relationships, this can be painfully subtle. If one person becomes angry whenever difficult truths are raised, the other person learns to avoid difficult truths. If affection is given after compliance and withdrawn after independence, the nervous system learns the cost of self-expression. If confusion follows every attempt at accountability, the person may begin doubting their own perception. If peace only exists when one person abandons their needs, then the relationship has created an interpretive field where self-erasure feels like maturity. This is not always intentional. Some people control others unconsciously because they are controlled by their own fear, shame, insecurity, or need for dominance. But whether conscious or unconscious, the effect can still shape interpretation. A person begins asking, "Am I being unreasonable?" when the better question might be, "What happens in this relationship when I try to name reality?" That question reveals the architecture. The same applies to public narratives. When a society is repeatedly told what to fear, what to desire, what to admire, what to ridicule, and what to ignore, perception is gradually trained. The field becomes normal. People begin to think inside categories they did not create. They inherit emotional associations. They inherit enemies. They inherit aspirations. They inherit taboos. They inherit moral reflexes. They may believe they are thinking independently while using a language of interpretation supplied by the culture around them. Again, the answer is not to reject all culture, all media, all authority, or all influence. That would not be discernment, that would be reaction in another form. The discerning mind does not ask, "How do I avoid being influenced?" That is impossible. It asks, "What is influencing me? How is it influencing me? And does this influence expand or contract my capacity to see clearly?" That is a much better question. Healthy influence expands awareness. It helps us become more honest, more grounded, more capable of holding complexity. It allows questions. It tolerates correction. It does not require emotional dependency. It does not punish uncertainty. It does not demand that we abandon our body, our conscience, or our perception to belong. Unhealthy influence narrows awareness. It rushes interpretation. It creates urgency. It turns doubt into guilt. It uses belonging as leverage. It makes one conclusion emotionally mandatory. So a practical discernment process begins to form. When you encounter a message, a person, a group, a story, or a system, pause and ask, "What emotional state is this creating in me? What interpretation does this state make more likely? What frame am I being invited into? What language is being repeated? What behavior is being rewarded? What doubt is being discouraged? Who benefits if I accept this meaning? What possibilities become harder to see once I enter this frame?" These questions do not make you paranoid. They make you awake. Paranoia assumes a hidden threat everywhere. Discernment observes influence everywhere without assuming every influence is malicious. That difference matters. The goal is not to become suspicious of life. The goal is to become less unconscious inside it, because the architecture of influence is always operating. In our homes, our feeds, our workplaces, our relationships, our institutions, our memories, and our own inner dialogue, we are constantly being invited into interpretations. Some of those interpretations, some clarify, some deceive, some regulate, some distort, some liberate, some make us easier to control. And once we understand that interpretation is shaped, not merely chosen, we become responsible for examining the forces that shape it. That is where discernment becomes a practice rather than a personality trait. It is not something we either have or lack. It is something we return to, especially when the frame is strong, the emotion is loud, the group is certain, and the reward for agreement feels safer than the cost of seeing clearly. Part 5: Why intelligent people still misinterpret reality. Intelligence versus discernment. One of the biggest mistakes we make is assuming that intelligence automatically protects a person from distortion. It does not. Intelligence can help someone analyze, compare, remember, calculate, argue, detect inconsistency, and process complexity, but intelligence alone does not guarantee discernment. A person can be highly intelligent and still be emotionally captured. They can be articulate and still be defensive. They can understand logic and still rationalize their own blind spots. They can recognize manipulation in others while remaining vulnerable to the forms of influence that flatter their identity, soothe their fear, or confirm what they already want to believe. This is an uncomfortable truth because many people treat intelligence as a shield. They assume that because they can think well, They cannot be deceived easily. But deception does not always enter through stupidity. It often enters through need, through fear, through pride, through shame, through loneliness, through belonging, through unresolved pain, through identity, through the emotional reward of certainty, through the desire to feel superior to those who are supposedly asleep, naive, immoral, ignorant, or easily led. That is why some of the most intelligent people can become trapped inside very sophisticated distortions. Their minds do not stop working. Their reasoning does not disappear. Their vocabulary may even become sharper. The problem is that their intelligence becomes recruited by an emotional position they have not examined. Instead of thinking freely, they begin thinking in the service of a conclusion already selected beneath conscious awareness. This is where discernment separates itself from intelligence. Intelligence asks, can I understand this? Discernment asks, what is shaping the way I understand this? Intelligence asks, can I make the argument? Discernment asks, why am I attached to this argument? Intelligence asks, can I find evidence? Discernment asks, am I only looking for evidence that protects my existing interpretation? Intelligence can build a case. Discernment examines the conditions under which the case was built. That distinction matters everywhere, in relationships, politics, religion, science, media, family systems, workplaces, and personal identity. Many conflicts are not sustained because people cannot think. They are sustained because people cannot question the emotional architecture beneath their thinking. A person may defend a belief not because the evidence is strong, but because the belief protects their sense of self. A family member may deny a harmful pattern not because they lack memory, but because acknowledging the pattern would collapse the family mythology. A professional may reject new information not because they are incapable of understanding it, but because accepting it would threaten years of status, training, or investment. A political group may ignore contradiction not because its members are unintelligent, but because belonging has become fused with interpretation. A person in a relationship may explain away controlling behavior not because they cannot see it, but because seeing it clearly would force them to confront loss, grief, loneliness, or the possibility that they have abandoned themselves. In each case, intelligence can become a defense mechanism. The person does not merely avoid reality, they explain their avoidance beautifully. This is why cognitive dissonance is so important to this episode. Cognitive dissonance is the discomfort that arises when a person holds conflicting beliefs, values, actions, or perceptions. But people do not always resolve that discomfort by becoming more honest. Often, they resolve it by adjusting the interpretation so they do not have to feel the conflict. They minimize, they justify, they attack the source, they reinterpret the event, they change the standard, they move the goalposts, they tell themselves it was not that bad, not that serious, not that clear, not what it looked like, not worth confronting. And the more intelligent the person is, the more sophisticated the justification can become. This is why intelligence can sometimes make distortion harder to detect. A simple lie may be easy to question. A highly intelligent rationalization can sound convincing even to the person creating it. It may contain partial truths, real examples, accurate observations, and logical fragments, but still be organized around emotional protection rather than reality. This is one of the most difficult forms of self-deception because it does not feel like deception. It feels like an analysis. Discernment asks us to notice when analysis is being used to avoid contact with something emotionally inconvenient. That might be grief, it might be guilt, it might be fear, it might be uncertainty, it might be responsibility, it might be a vulnerability, it might be the humiliation of having been wrong, it might be the pain of realizing we trusted someone who did not deserve it, it might be the destabilizing awareness that a group, belief system, relationship, or identity no longer feels as solid as it once did. The intelligent mind often tries to resolve this by controlling the narrative. If the story can be organized, the discomfort can be contained. If blame can be placed elsewhere, the self can remain intact. If the other person can be made entirely wrong, we do not have to examine our contribution. If the opposing group can be made entirely stupid or evil, we do not have to examine why their position exists. If our own side can be made entirely righteous, we do not have to examine its shadow. This is the seduction of certainty. Certainty can feel like clarity, but they are not the same thing. Certainty closes the field. Clarity illuminates it. Certainty often says, I do not need to look further. Clarity says, I can see enough to respond while remaining open to what I do not yet know. Certainty can be emotionally addictive because it reduces tension. It gives the nervous system somewhere to land. It turns complexity into a simpler structure, good and bad, right and wrong, victim and villain, enlightened and asleep, intelligent and ignorant, safe and unsafe. But reality is often more layered than that. Discernment does not mean refusing to make judgments. That would be another distortion. Sometimes a situation is harmful. Sometimes a person is manipulative. Sometimes a claim is false. Sometimes a system is corrupt. Sometimes a boundary must be set. Sometimes a conclusion is necessary. But discernment does not rush into judgment simply because judgment feels relieving. It examines the field first. It asks what is known, what is assumed, what is felt, what is missing, what is being rewarded, what is being avoided, and what the consequences of the interpretation might be. This is especially important in the age of information overload. Intelligent people often believe that consuming more information will automatically lead to better discernment. But information without integration can create the illusion of depth. A person can consume endless books, podcasts, papers, videos, commentary, and debates while becoming less clear, not more. They may gather fragments from everywhere, but never examine the emotional state that determines how those fragments are arranged. They may mistake accumulation for understanding. They may mistake complexity for wisdom. They may mistake being informed for being grounded. Discernment requires integration. It requires the ability to metabolize information through reflection, emotional awareness, embodiment, and ethical responsibility. Without that, the mind becomes a collector of material for its existing patterns. If someone is fearful, they collect threats. If they are angry, they collect enemies. If they are ashamed, they collect proof of inadequacy. If they are prideful, they collect proof of superiority. If they are lonely, they collect belonging signals. If they are wounded, they collect explanations that protect the wound from being touched. This is where identity becomes perhaps the strongest distorting force. Once an interpretation becomes part of who we believe we are, challenging it no longer feels like changing our mind. It feels like losing ourselves. If I am the kind of person who sees through everything, then admitting I was deceived becomes almost unbearable. If I am the kind of person who is rational, then noticing my emotional bias becomes threatening. If I am the kind of person who is compassionate, then recognizing my resentment becomes shameful. If I am the kind of person who is awake, then admitting confusion feels like failure. If I am the kind of person who is loyal, then questioning the group feels like betrayal. This is why the most dangerous phrase in discernment may be, I am not the kind of person who would fall for that. That statement may feel empowering, but it can also become a blindfold. Everyone has openings. Everyone has emotional access points. Everyone has needs. Everyone has a history. Everyone has incentives. Everyone has moments where loneliness, fear, pride, love, guilt, urgency, or desire can shape perception. The discerning person is not the one who believes they are immune. The discerning person is the one who studies their own vulnerability honestly. This is also why humility is not optional. It is a cognitive tool. Humility keeps perception flexible. It allows revision. It allows correction. It allows us to say, I may be missing something. It allows us to recognize that being wrong is not the same as being worthless. It allows us to update our interpretation without experiencing it as annihilation. Without humility, intelligence becomes brittle. It becomes a fortress. It protects itself from the very information that could refine it. And this brings us back to emotional intelligence. A person with high analytical ability but low emotional awareness may not notice when they are reasoning from shame, fear, envy, resentment, or pride. They may appear rational, but the emotional premise remains hidden. A person with emotional awareness but weak critical thinking may feel deeply, but struggle to test their interpretation. The discernment field is built on the integration of both. We need the mind sharp enough to examine claims, and the self-awareness deep enough to examine the state during the examining. This is where contemplative reasoning enters. Contemplative reasoning is not passive thinking. It is thinking with space around it. It allows a person to examine not only the object of thought, but the posture of the thinker. Why am I leaning this way? Why do I want this to be true? Why does this interpretation feel satisfying? Why does that possibility irritate me? Why do I feel threatened by nuance? Why do I want a villain? Why do I want innocence? Why do I need certainty right now? These questions slow the machinery of self-protection. They do not guarantee perfect perception, but they create the conditions for better perception. A practical example, imagine you encounter someone who strongly disagrees with you. Reaction may say, they are ignorant. Intelligence may build an argument against them. But discernment asks, what do I need them to be ignorant of to avoid considering? That question does not mean they are right. It means you are examining the emotional convenience of your interpretation. Perhaps their argument is weak. Perhaps their evidence is poor. Perhaps their conclusion is harmful. But if your identity depends on them being stupid, you are no longer only evaluating their position. You are protecting your own. Another example, imagine someone you trusted behaves in a way that unsettles you. Reaction may say, they would never do that. Intelligence may generate reasons to explain it away. Discernment asks, am I interpreting this through evidence, or through my fear of what it would mean if I saw it clearly? Again, this does not mean assuming guilt. It means not allowing emotional investment to erase observation. This is the discipline. Discernment is not about being the cleverest person in the room. It is about being less captured by the need to be right, safe, admired, certain, innocent, superior, or included. It is about having enough inner stability to let reality interrupt your preferred story. It is about allowing truth to be inconvenient without immediately turning away from it. So when we ask why intelligent people still misinterpret reality, the answer is not that intelligence is useless. Intelligence is valuable. It can be beautiful. It can reveal patterns, build knowledge, solve problems, challenge falsehoods, and expand understanding. But intelligence must be joined to humility, regulation, emotional literacy, ethical awareness, and the capacity to update. Otherwise, intelligence can become a servant of distortion. And perhaps this is one of the central lessons of this whole series. The mind does not become discerning simply because it can think. It becomes discerning when it can observe the forces shaping its thought. That is the difference between being clever and becoming clear. Part 6, Contemplative Observation, Slowing Interpretation. If the first 5 parts of this episode have shown us how interpretation becomes distorted through reaction, emotion, nervous system activation, influence, identity, and intelligence without humility, then Part 6 begins the turn towards practice. Because it is not enough to understand distortion, we have to create a way of interrupting it. We need a method for slowing the automatic movement from stimulus to story, from feeling to conclusion, from certainty to behavior. This is where contemplative observation enters the discernment field. Contemplative observation is not passivity, it is not indecision, it is not sitting back while life happens around us. It is the disciplined ability to observe what is happening inside and outside before interpretation becomes locked into reaction. It is a form of inner spacing, a way of creating enough distance between the event and the meaning that perception can widen before behavior follows. In a world that constantly rewards speed, this is almost a rebellious act. To slow down is to refuse the command of the reaction economy. It is to say, I will not let urgency become my only intelligence. Most people do not struggle because they cannot think. They struggle because thinking often begins after interpretation has already taken shape. The body has reacted. The emotion has colored the lens. The identity has become involved. The nervous system has narrowed the field. The social pressure has started to whisper. Then the mind arrives and says, this is what I think. But by then, thought may already be serving a state rather than examining reality. Contemplative observation interrupts this sequence. It asks the mind to become aware of the conditions under which it is thinking. This is why observation has to come before judgment. Judgment is sometimes necessary. Discernment does not mean floating forever in uncertainty. There are times when a decision has to be made, a boundary has to be set, a truth has to be named, or a situation has to be left. But judgment that arrives too early often becomes a reaction disguised as clarity. It closes the field before enough has been seen. It reduces the situation to the emotional meaning that feels most immediate. Observation keeps the field open long enough for more reality to enter. The first practice of contemplative observation is simple, but difficult. Notice the moment interpretation begins, not after the argument, not after the post has been shared, not after the accusation has been made, not after the message has been sent. Notice the beginning, the tightening in the body, the quick assumption, the emotional charge, the need to explain, the impulse to defend, the sudden certainty, the urge to withdraw, the desire to prove, the wish to control the meaning before it becomes unbearable. That beginning point is sacred in discernment because it is where freedom still exists. Once the story becomes fully formed, it becomes harder to interrupt. Once the body has prepared for battle, escape, collapse, or appeasement, the mind often builds a worldview around that preparation. But if we can notice the first movement, even for a second, we create a crack in the automatic sequence. We can ask, what is happening here? Not only out there, but in here. What am I feeling before I decide what this means? This is where the first discernment pause becomes useful. It is not a rigid technique. It is a small doorway back into awareness. The pause asks, what emotion is activated? What assumption am I making? What evidence exists? What might I not yet understand? What interpretation feels emotionally rewarding? What happens if I slow down? These questions do not remove the need for judgment. They refine the quality of judgment. They help us see whether we are responding to reality, memory, fear, desire, identity, or social pressure. The question, what emotion is activated, comes first because emotion is often the lens. If fear is active, interpretation may search for a threat. If anger is active, it may search for offense. If shame is active, it may search for exposure. If desire is active, it may search for fulfillment. If guilt is active, it may search for responsibility, even where responsibility is shared or unclear. Naming the emotion does not make it disappear, but it prevents it from becoming invisible. An invisible emotion is far more likely to become an unconscious interpretation. The question, what assumption am I making, comes next because assumptions are often the bridge between event and story. Someone pauses before replying, and the assumption is that they are annoyed. Someone disagrees, and the assumption is that they are attacking. Someone asks a question, and the assumption is that they are doubting you. A headline appears, and the assumption is that it confirms what you already believe. Assumptions are not always wrong. Sometimes they are based on experience, pattern recognition, and subtle cues. But until they are recognized as assumptions, they masquerade as facts. Then comes the question, what evidence exists? This is the grounding movement. It brings interpretation back to observable reality. What was actually said? What was actually done? What pattern has occurred over time? What source is being used? What context is missing? What would I need to know before concluding? This is where critical thinking enters the contemplative process. Evidence matters, but it has to be examined without pretending. The examiner is emotionally neutral. The goal is not cold objectivity. The goal is honest observation. The next question is perhaps one of the most humbling. What might I not yet understand? This question introduces humility into perception. It reminds us that the first frame may not be the whole frame. There may be missing context. There may be another person's emotional reality. There may be structural pressures we have not seen. There may be incentives beneath the surface. There may be a history we do not know. There may be a misunderstanding. There may also be manipulation we have not yet identified. Humility does not mean excusing everything. It means keeping perception flexible enough to receive what is still hidden. Then we ask, what interpretation feels emotionally rewarding? This question is powerful because many interpretations are attractive, not because they are accurate, but because they provide relief. Blaming someone may relieve shame. Seeing ourselves as completely innocent may relieve guilt. Seeing another group as stupid may relieve the discomfort of complexity. Seeing a person as evil may relieve the pain of ambiguity. Seeing ourselves as uniquely awake may relieve the fear of being ordinary or uncertain. Emotional reward does not automatically make an interpretation false, but it does make it worth examining. And finally, what happens if I slow down? This is the question that challenges urgency. Many manipulative fields depend on speed. React now, choose now, condemn now, agree now, reply now, buy now, believe now, fear now, join now, cut them off now, prove yourself now. But discernment often begins when speed is interrupted. Slowing down does not mean avoiding action. It means refusing to let activation set the pace of perception. Sometimes the most powerful response is not immediate speech, but delayed clarity. In real life, this pause can change everything. Imagine a difficult message arrives. The first reaction is heat in the chest, tightening in the stomach, a rush of defense. The reactive mind wants to reply immediately to correct, explain, accuse, or reclaim control. But contemplative observation says, wait, what emotion is here? Anger. What assumption is forming? They are disrespecting me. What evidence exists? They used blunt words, but I do not yet know their tone or intent. What might I not understand? They may be stressed, careless, or do something clumsily. What interpretation feels rewarding? The interpretation that I am fully right and they are fully wrong. What happens if I slow down? I may respond with more precision and less damage. This does not guarantee the other person is innocent. It does not mean swallowing disrespect. It means giving yourself enough space to respond from clarity rather than from the first wound that rose to the surface. Contemplative observation also changes how we engage with public information. A clip appears online. It is emotionally charged. The caption tells you what to feel. The comments are already outraged. The group has begun forming around an interpretation. The body feels pulled to join the certainty, but the pause asks, what frame am I being given? What has been cut out? What source is this? What emotion is being activated? Who benefits from my immediate reaction? What would I need to know before treating this as complete? Again, this is not apathy. It is disciplined attention. This is especially important because modern media environments often collapse the distance between perception and reaction. We are shown fragments as if they are wholes. We are invited to feel before we understand. We are rewarded for public judgment before private reflection. The result is a culture where people can become emotionally committed to interpretations they have barely examined. Contemplative observation restores sequence. First observe, then feel consciously, then examine, then interpret, then respond. In this sense, contemplative reasoning and emotional intelligence are not separate. They are interdependent. Emotional intelligence without contemplation can become self-expression without examination. Critical thinking without contemplation can become argument without self-awareness. But when they come together, something more mature emerges. The person learns to think with awareness of state. They learn to feel without being possessed by feeling. They learn to reason without using reason as a weapon against vulnerability. This also requires us to distinguish between intuition and projection. Intuition is often quiet, spacious, and pattern-sensitive. Projection is often urgent, repetitive, and emotionally loaded. Intuition may say, pay attention. Projection says, I already know. Intuition allows investigation. Projection resists it. Intuition can tolerate being wrong. Projection often cannot. This does not mean intuition is always calm, or projection is always loud, but the distinction is useful. Contemplative observation gives us space to ask, is this a subtle knowing, or is this an old pattern wearing the mask of knowing? That question is particularly important for people who have experienced trauma, betrayal, manipulation, or emotional inconsistency. When the nervous system has been trained by instability, it may become highly sensitive to threat. That sensitivity can be protective. It can detect things others miss, but it can also overread ambiguity. It can interpret unfamiliar safety as danger. It can treat uncertainty as abandonment. It can turn minor inconsistency into evidence of major betrayal. The answer is not to silence the body. The answer is to develop enough contemplative space to translate the body carefully. This is where discernment becomes compassionate. Not soft, not naive, but compassionate. It recognizes that many distortions formed as survival adaptations. The person who overthinks may once have needed to predict emotional danger. The person who reacts defensively may once have needed to protect themselves from shame. The person who distrusts kindness may once have learned that warmth came with conditions. The person who avoids conflict may once have learned that honesty was punished. Contemplative observation does not shame these patterns. It brings them into awareness so they no longer have to run the whole system. There is also an ethical dimension to this. When we become more aware of our own interpretive process, we become less likely to project unexamined material onto others. We become less likely to punish people for meanings we added. We become less likely to mistake our wounds for their intentions. We become less likely to join collective outrage without understanding the field. We become less likely to use intelligence as a defense against humility. We become more responsible for the atmosphere we create with our words, our reactions, and our certainty. This does not mean we become endlessly self-doubting. That is not discernment either. Some people confuse self-awareness with chronic self-suspicion. They question themselves so much that they lose the ability to act. The goal is not paralysis. The goal is grounded responsiveness. A discerning person can still say no. They can still cause harm. They can still disagree. They can still leave. They can still decide. But their decision has passed through observation, not merely activation. This is why the pause is not meant to be a prison. It is a passage. It is the space where raw reaction becomes conscious response. And sometimes that space only needs to be a few seconds. A breath before replying. A walk before deciding. The night before confronting. A question before accusing. A moment of bodily awareness before sharing the post. A quiet recognition, I am activated, so I will not let this state be the only author of my interpretation. Over time, this changes the structure of perception. The nervous system learns that not every stimulus requires an immediate reaction. The mind learns that certainty can wait. The body learns that ambiguity is survivable. The self learns that being wrong is not annihilation. Relationships become less governed by projection. Thinking becomes less governed by threat. Discernment becomes less of an idea and more of a practice carried in the body. And perhaps this is the deeper purpose of contemplative observation. It does not promise perfect clarity. It does not remove bias, emotion, history, or influence, but it creates a living space inside the interpretive process, a space where reality has a chance to be more than our first reaction to it, because the world will keep provoking us. People will misunderstand us. The media will frame reality. Groups will reward certainty. Fear will seek conclusions. Desire will seek confirmation. Shame will seek hiding. Anger will seek a target. The question is not whether these forces will appear. They will. The question is whether there is enough awareness in us to meet them before they become the whole story. That is contemplative observation. Not the absence of reaction, but the return of consciousness before reaction becomes identity. Part 7, Real-World Field Scenario, Applied Discernment. This is where the discernment field becomes practical. Up to this point, we have explored interpretation, emotion, the nervous system, influence, intelligence, and contemplative observation. But discernment is not only a concept to understand, it is something to apply in real time, especially when the field becomes emotionally charged. So in this part, we move into a hybrid scenario, a public health news event, a public controversy, and the everyday emotional mechanisms that turn uncertainty into reaction. Let's begin with an emotionally loaded example, a disease-related news story. Recently, hantavirus became part of public conversation again after a cluster linked to the MV Hondias cruise ship was reported internationally. Health agencies described a serious outbreak connected to the Andes virus strain, with confirmed cases and deaths, while also emphasizing that wider public risk remained very low, and that hantavirus is not spread through ordinary everyday social contact. The UK Health Security Agency stated that the public risk was very low, and the World Health Organization reported that the outbreak was linked to a specific cruise ship travel cluster rather than a general public threat. UK Health Security Agency blog. Now that combination of facts is exactly the kind of field where interpretation becomes unstable. There is real seriousness, illness, death, uncertainty, investigation, containment, public health response. But there is also limitation, specific exposure context, health agency monitoring, low public risk, and no immediate evidence that the situation represents a broad pandemic threat. AP also reported that the vessel docked for disinfection in Rotterdam, with remaining crew and medical personnel quarantined and tested, while officials stressed minimal public risk under containment protocols. AP News. So what happens when this enters the emotional field? The stimulus appears first. A headline, a post, a short video, a phrase like deadly virus outbreak on cruise ship, perhaps an image of a ship, perhaps a mention of quarantine, perhaps a reminder of the pandemic years. Perhaps someone posts, here we go again. Someone else says, they're preparing the next one. Another person says, you people never take anything seriously. The event itself may be specific, contained, and still developing, but the interpretive field expands far beyond the facts. That is the first stage, stimulus. The second stage is emotional activation. For some people, the word virus immediately activates fear. For others, it activates anger. For others, distrust. For others, grief, memory, exhaustion, ridicule, or defiance. The same news event does not land in one neutral public mind. It lands in millions of nervous systems shaped by memory. For someone who lost a loved one during a previous public health crisis, the story may activate vulnerability. For someone who felt controlled, misled, or socially shamed during that period, it may activate resistance. For someone who trusts institutions, it may activate concern and compliance. For someone who distrusts institutions, it may activate suspicion and pattern recognition. None of these reactions emerges from the headline alone. They emerge from the field of memory around the headline. Then comes interpretation. This is where the mind tries to organize the emotional charge. One person interprets the story as evidence that public health systems must act quickly. Another interprets it as evidence that fear is being seeded. Another interprets it as a warning sign of system failure. Another interprets it as media sensationalism. Another dismisses it entirely because they have developed a reflex against health-related alerts. Another becomes anxious because they cannot easily evaluate the risk. Here, the discerning question is not, which emotion is stupid? That is too crude. The discerning question is, what is each emotional state making easier or harder to see? Fear may make the danger visible, but exaggerate the probability. Anger may make manipulation visible, but dismiss genuine risk. Trust may make cooperation easier, but reduce scrutiny. Distrust may increase scrutiny, but distort proportion. Exhaustion may protect against panic, but also create apathy. This is why discernment is more mature than either fear or denial. It can hold seriousness and proportion at the same time. The fourth stage is narrative formation. The mind does not like open loops, especially around threat, so it begins forming a story. This is the next public health scare. This is nothing. This proves authorities are incompetent. This proves people are reckless. This proves travel is unsafe. This proves the media is manipulating emotion. This proves those who warned us were right. Notice how quickly a specific event becomes absorbed into existing worldviews. The story is no longer only about antivirus. It becomes about trust, control, freedom, institutions, memory, identity, and moral positioning. This is where recent public controversies often follow the same structure. A public figure says something ambiguous. A clip is taken from a longer interview. A celebrity is accused of hypocrisy. A politician uses a charged phrase. A company launches an advert that touches identity, class, sex, race, health, parenting, or belief. Within hours, the controversy becomes less about the original event and more about the meaning attached to it. One group sees harm. Another sees overreaction. One sees accountability. Another sees mob behavior. One sees truth-telling. Another sees cruelty. The same structure appears. Stimulus, emotional activation, interpretation, narrative formation. Then comes social reinforcement. This is where the interpretation gains momentum. The person checks the comments. They find others who feel the same. The body receives relief, I am not alone. The group begins repeating phrases. Screenshots circulate, short clips are clipped even further. Nuance becomes less rewarding than allegiance. The more a post confirms the group's emotional state, the more shareable it becomes. The social field begins telling people not only what to think, but what kind of person they are if they think it. This is one of the most important elements in applied discernment. Once interpretation becomes social, changing your mind becomes harder. You are no longer only revising a view. You may feel as if you are risking belonging, status, moral identity, or credibility. If you were publicly outraged, it becomes difficult to later say, I reacted before I understood. If you mocked concern, it becomes difficult to later say, actually, this had more complexity than I allowed. The social field rewards consistency, even when clarity requires revision. Then comes the behavioral reaction. In a public health scenario, this might mean panic sharing, mocking, stockpiling, dismissing official guidance, attacking others, spreading unverified claims, or treating every update as proof of a pre-existing narrative. In a public controversy, it might mean piling on, defending blindly, cutting people off, posting moral declarations, refusing context, or using the situation to confirm tribal identity. In a relationship, it might mean sending an angry message. In a workplace, it might mean gossip. In a family, it might mean repeating the old role, accuser, rescuer, avoider, peacekeeper. So how do we reconstruct the scenario through discernment? We begin again with the stimulus. What actually happened? In the hantavirus example, the grounded version is not a new pandemic is here, or nothing happened. The grounded version is more precise. A serious but specific cluster was linked to a cruise ship. Health agencies investigated. Cases and deaths were reported. Containment measures were used, and public health agencies described the wider public risk as very low. Reuters reported that Britain obtained an experimental antiviral from Japan to support preparedness, while also noting WHO's position that there was no evidence of mutations suggesting increased transmissibility or severity. Reuters, that is discernment. Seriousness without inflation, proportionality without dismissal. Next, we identify emotional activation. What does this story activate in me? Fear, anger, distrust, exhaustion? Curiosity, a desire to prove a point, a desire to be first with a warning, a desire to mock people who are concerned. This step matters because the emotion may be valid, but it will shape interpretation. If I know I am angry, I can watch for overreach. If I know I am afraid, I can watch for catastrophe thinking. If I know I am distrustful, I can watch for premature pattern completion. If I know I am exhausted, I can watch for careless dismissal. Then we separate interpretation from evidence. What do I know? What do I not know? What source am I using? Is this a health agency update, a news report, a screenshot, a rumor, a commentator, or a friend's emotional caption? What is confirmed? What is inferred? What is being framed? What is the time frame? Has the situation changed? Is the claim about a specific exposure group being stretched into a claim about the whole public? Then we examine narrative formation. What story am I tempted to place this inside? Is this becoming another chapter in an existing worldview? Am I making the facts serve a larger emotional narrative? Am I using this event to confirm what I already believed about government, media, public health, travel, society, or other people? Again, the story may contain truth, but discernment asks whether the event supports the full weight of the story being placed upon it. Then we examine social reinforcement. Who is rewarding my reaction? What does my group want me to conclude? What conclusion would cost me status? What would happen if I said this is serious, but not yet what people are making it? What would happen if I said I understand why people are suspicious, but we still need accurate risk assessment? The discerning position often frustrates both extremes because it refuses emotional simplicity. Finally, we chose a behavioral response. What is the most grounded action? Maybe it is to read a primary source before posting. Maybe it is better to wait for more information. Maybe it is to share an update with proportionate language. Maybe it is to avoid mocking people who are worried. Maybe it is to avoid escalating fear. Maybe it is time to ask, what is the actual risk to ordinary people, and what is the specific exposure route? Maybe it is to recognize that health events can be serious without becoming symbolic proof of everything else we fear. Now let's bring this into a public controversy. Imagine a public figure is accused of saying something offensive. The clip is circulating. The caption tells you what to feel. The comments are already divided. One side says, this proves who they really are. Another side says, this is manufactured outrage. The stimulus is the clip. Emotional activation may be moral anger, tribal loyalty, disgust, fear of social contamination, or pleasure at seeing someone disliked being exposed. Interpretation follows: innocent, victim, villain, witch hunt, accountability. Narrative formation turns the event into a wider story about culture, censorship, morality, hypocrisy, power, or decline. Social reinforcement then locks people into camps. Behavioral reaction follows: pile-on, defense, ridicule, cancellation, counterattack, or public performance. Applied discernment asks, what is the full context? What exactly was said? What came before and after? Is the interpretation proportional? Is the harm real, exaggerated, minimized, or being used strategically? Who benefits from outrage? Who benefits from dismissal? Is the person being held accountable, or is the crowd seeking emotional discharge? Am I responding to the event, or to what the event symbolizes to me? The point is not to avoid conclusions. The point is to earn them. This is the signature practice of the discernment field. Slow the field down. Identify the stimulus. Name the emotional activation. Separate evidence from interpretation. Observe narrative formation. Notice social reinforcement. Examine behavioral reaction. Then reconstruct the situation through proportion, humility, and grounded response. Because the modern world does not only give us events, it gives us emotionally charged interpretive fields. And if we do not learn to read those fields, we become easier to move through fear, anger, belonging, shame, urgency, and moral performance. The crisis of interpretation is not solved by having no reaction. It is solved by learning how to examine reaction before it becomes reality. Part 8: Integration. The crisis is not only informative, so as we come towards the end of this first episode, we return to the central idea that opened the field. Human beings do not simply react to reality. We react to our interpretation of reality, and that interpretation is never formed in a vacuum. It is shaped by emotion, memory, nervous system state, identity, social pressure, language, influence, repetition, and the hidden incentives moving beneath behavior. This is why the modern crisis cannot be understood only as an information crisis. Yes, misinformation matters, deception matters, propaganda matters, distorted narratives matter, emotional manipulation matters, but the deeper question is not only what information is being presented to me. The deeper question is, what state am I in as I receive it? Because the same information can be interpreted very differently, depending on whether we are afraid, ashamed, angry, exhausted, isolated, desperate for belonging, or hungry for certainty. This is where discernment has to become more than opinion. It has to become a practice, not a performance of intelligence, not a posture of superiority, not the habit of mistrusting everything, but a practice of returning to observation before reaction becomes identity. Because once reaction becomes identity, it stops feeling like a response. It starts feeling like who we are. That is dangerous. If fear becomes identity, the world begins to look like threat. If anger becomes identity, the world begins to look like offense. If shame becomes identity, the world begins to look like exposure. If suspicion becomes identity, the world begins to look like deception. If belonging becomes identity, the group begins to feel more real than reality itself. If certainty becomes identity, doubt begins to feel like collapse. So the first movement of discernment is not to gather more information. It is to notice the interpreter. Who in me is reading this? What state is interpreting? What wound is listening? What fear is organizing the facts? What desire is bending the evidence? What identity is being protected? What group atmosphere is influencing my conclusion? What emotional reward am I receiving from this interpretation? These are not comfortable questions, but they are clarifying questions. They bring consciousness back into the process before the process becomes automatic. This is the difference between reacting and responding. Reaction is immediate, compressed, and often state-bound. Response has space in it. Response can still be strong. It can still be firm. It can still set boundaries, name harm, reject falsehood, challenge manipulation, and act with conviction. But response has passed through awareness. It has been touched by observation. It has allowed reality to be more complex than the first emotional surge. That matters because discernment is not passivity. It is not endlessly delaying judgment. It is not refusing to take a position. It is not pretending that all interpretations are equal. Some interpretations are more grounded than others. Some claims are false. Some behaviors are manipulative. Some systems are exploitative. Some relationships are harmful. Some narratives are dangerous. Discernment does not erase judgment. It improves the quality of judgment, and quality matters. A judgment formed through fear is different from a judgment formed through clarity. A boundary formed through self-respect is different from a boundary formed through projection. A criticism formed through evidence is different from a criticism formed through group emotion. A conclusion formed after examination is different from a conclusion formed because it brought relief. This is why the discernment field begins with interpretation rather than ideology, because before we can examine the world clearly, we must examine the field through which the world enters us. That field includes the body, it includes emotion, it includes language, it includes our history, it includes the groups we belong to, it includes the incentives we are responding to, it includes the stories we have inherited and the stories we have created to survive. This is where discernment becomes deeply human. It is not about becoming less emotional, it is about becoming more honest with emotion. It is not about becoming less influenced. It is about becoming more conscious of influence. It is not about becoming less relational. It is about understanding how relationships shape perception. It is not about becoming colder. It is about becoming clearer. Because clarity without compassion can become cruelty. Compassion without clarity can become self-abandonment. Intelligence without humility can become rationalization. Emotion without examination can become distortion. Skepticism without grounding can become paranoia. Trust without discernment can become vulnerability to manipulation. The work is integration, to feel but not be ruled by feeling, to think but not hide inside thought, to question but not collapse into cynicism, to trust but not abandon observation, to notice patterns but not project them everywhere, to recognize manipulation but not see every human flaw as a strategy, to remain open without becoming naive, and cautious without becoming closed. That is the field. And it is not easy because modern life constantly pulls us away from that center. It pushes speed, it pushes outrage, it pushes certainty. It pushes identity, it pushes performance, it pushes emotional reaction as proof of moral clarity. It pushes information without integration. It pushes people into camps before they have had time to understand the full terrain. But discernment asks for something slower. It asks us to pause, to breathe, to observe, to locate the emotion, to test the evidence, to question the frame, to examine the incentive, to watch the group, to notice the body, to allow uncertainty without surrendering responsibility. And perhaps that is one of the most important lessons from this first episode. Uncertainty is not the enemy of discernment. Uncertainty is often where discernment begins. When we cannot tolerate uncertainty, we reach too quickly for certainty. And when we reach too quickly for certainty, we become easier to manipulate. We become easier to provoke, flatter, shame, recruit, divide, and control. A discerning person does not need to know everything immediately. They can remain in the question long enough for the field to become clearer. They can say, I do not yet know. They can say, I need more context. They can say, this may be serious, but I will not inflate it. They can say, this may be manipulative, but I will not project beyond the evidence. They can say, this emotion is real, but it may not be the whole truth. They can say, I was wrong. They can say, I need to revise my interpretation. That is not weakness. That is maturity. The crisis of interpretation is not solved by becoming emotionless, hyper-rational, or suspicious of everything. It is solved by becoming more conscious of the process by which reality becomes meaning inside us. Because interpretation is where the world becomes personal. It is where fact becomes story, where sensation becomes judgment, where emotion becomes belief, where language becomes atmosphere, and where influence becomes behavior. So if there is one practice to take from this episode, let it be this: before reacting, ask what is interpreting. Not just, what do I think? But, what state is thinking? Not just, what do I feel? What meaning is this feeling creating? Not just what happened, but what story did I build around what happened? Not just who influenced me, but what in me was available to be influenced. This is not self-doubt for the sake of self-doubt. It is self-honesty in service of clearer perception. Because the goal of discernment is not to become someone who believes nothing. That is not wisdom. That is a collapse wearing the mask of intelligence. The goal is to become someone who can believe more carefully, question more honestly, feel more consciously, and respond more cleanly. To see clearly does not mean seeing everything. None of us see everything. It means becoming more aware of the lenses we are looking through. That is where the discernment field truly begins. In the next episode, we move into one of the most misunderstood ideas in modern emotional life: emotional intelligence. Because emotional intelligence is not emotional suppression. It is not staying calm as a performance. It is not being agreeable, endlessly patient, or socially polished. It is not the absence of anger, fear, grief, or intensity. Emotional intelligence is the ability to understand what emotion is doing inside perception, communication, behavior, and relationship. It is the ability to recognize the emotional lens before it becomes the whole world. It is the capacity to feel without immediately turning feeling into final truth. So in episode 2, we will explore why emotional intelligence is not emotional control. We will look at the difference between regulation and repression, awareness and performance, emotional truth and factual truth, self-expression and self-possession. And we will ask a deeper question: what happens when a person can name emotion, but still cannot discern what that emotion is doing to their interpretation of reality? Because in the end, discernment is not only a thinking skill, it is an emotional discipline. And emotional intelligence is not about escaping emotion. It is about learning how to remain conscious inside it. As you leave this first episode, consider one question: Where in your life have you mistaken the first interpretation for the clearest one? Not to judge yourself, not to shame yourself, but to notice, because noticing is where the field begins to change. May you move slowly enough to see what reaction wants to hide. May you stay open enough to question what certainty tries to close. May you remain grounded enough to feel deeply without being carried away by the first story the feeling creates. Until next time, thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to the Discernment Field, Episode 1, The Crisis of Interpretation, Why We Can Struggle to See Clearly. I'm James Miller.